What seemed like a routine interview quickly spiraled when one question shifted the entire mood. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? One that slowly shifts from polite discussion into a firm, unmistakable moment of tension. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It begins like many segments on The View, calm, structured, and seemingly predictable. The panel is seated, the audience is settled, and the tone is conversational. On this particular day, the discussion is centered around media representation and the evolving expectations placed on actors in today's entertainment landscape. It's a topic the show frequently revisits, often bringing in guests who can offer first-hand perspective. That's where Topher Grace enters the conversation. He's introduced warmly, greeted with applause, and welcomed as someone who has spent years navigating both television and film. His demeanor is relaxed, even slightly reserved, as he thanks the hosts and takes his seat. There's nothing unusual in his body language. He leans slightly forward, attentive, hands loosely clasped, appearing ready for a standard promotional interview with some thoughtful discussion layered in. Across from him sits Sunny Hostin, who, as viewers of the show know, often brings a more analytical and direct perspective to conversations. She listens closely as Topher begins answering initial questions about his recent work, occasionally nodding but maintaining a focused, evaluative expression. The first few minutes unfold smoothly. The panel discusses Topher's latest project, touching on the themes it explores and how audiences have responded. He speaks clearly, choosing his words carefully, offering insight into his approach to roles and how he thinks about storytelling. The other hosts contribute lighter commentary, occasionally steering the conversation toward broader entertainment topics. Then, as often happens on live television, the conversation begins to shift. Sunny leans slightly forward, her tone still measured but more pointed as she transitions from discussing the project itself to asking about responsibility. Specifically, the responsibility actors have when portraying certain types of characters. It's not an abrupt shift, but it's noticeable. The framing of her question carries a subtle weight, suggesting she's not just asking for general thoughts, but for a more defined stance. Topher listens without interrupting, his expression neutral but attentive. There's a slight pause before he answers, the kind of pause that signals he's considering how best to respond. He begins by acknowledging the complexity of the issue, noting that actors often work within scripts and creative teams, and that storytelling involves multiple perspectives. At this point, the tone is still calm, but there's a subtle change in pacing. Sunny follows up, this time narrowing the focus. She references specific types of portrayals in media and asks whether actors should push back more when they feel a narrative might be problematic. Her delivery remains professional, but there's a firmness in her voice that shifts the energy of the conversation. The audience, while quiet, seems more attentive now. You can sense a slight shift in the room, the kind that happens when a discussion moves from general commentary into something more personal or potentially contentious. Topher responds again, this time a bit more directly. He explains that while he understands the concern, he believes there's also value in portraying flawed characters and complex situations. He emphasizes that storytelling isn't always about presenting ideal behavior, but about reflecting reality, even when that reality is uncomfortable. As he speaks, his posture changes slightly. He sits a bit more upright, his hands now moving occasionally to emphasize points. It's not defensive, but it is more engaged. He's no longer just answering questions. He's actively clarifying his perspective. Sunny listens, but her expression suggests she's not entirely satisfied with the answer. She interjects briefly, asking whether that approach risks normalizing certain behaviors if they're not clearly challenged within the narrative. This is the moment where the exchange begins to feel less like a standard interview and more like a structured debate. Topher doesn't immediately respond. There's a brief pause, just a second or two, but on live television, it's noticeable. He then leans slightly forward and answers in a more deliberate tone. He acknowledges the concern again, but reiterates that audiences are capable of interpreting nuance. He suggests that not every story needs to explicitly guide the viewer toward a conclusion. The pacing slows. Each response is more measured, each question more precise. Other hosts begin to step in lightly, attempting to balance the discussion. One offers a broader perspective, noting that this tension between artistic freedom and social responsibility has been part of media conversations for decades. Another tries to bring the tone back to something more conversational, adding a comment about how audiences themselves have changed over time. But the focus keeps returning to the exchange between Topher and Sunny. Sunny asks another question, this time more direct than before. She brings up the idea of accountability, asking whether actors should take a stronger public stance when controversies arise around the content they're involved in. Topher's response is calm, but there's a noticeable firmness now. He explains that while he believes in accountability, he also thinks it's important to avoid oversimplifying complex creative processes. He points out that actors are part of a larger system and that decisions are rarely made in isolation. His tone remains respectful, but there's a subtle shift. It's no longer just explanatory, it's assertive. The audience reacts quietly, no audible interruption, but there's a sense of engagement. Some heads nod, others remain still, watching closely. The hosts exchange quick glances, the kind that suggests they're aware the conversation is becoming more serious. Sunny responds again, maintaining her composure, but continuing to press the point. She clarifies that her concern isn't about limiting creativity, but about recognizing influence. Her voice remains steady, but the emphasis in her words makes it clear she's not backing away from the topic. Topher listens fully before responding, which adds to the tension in a subtle way. There's no interruption, no overlap, just a steady, deliberate exchange. When he does speak, he does so with clarity, stating that he respects her perspective, but sees it differently. He explains that he believes audiences benefit from being trusted to engage critically with what they watch. At this stage, the conversation has clearly shifted from a routine interview into a focused, thoughtful disagreement. There's no raised voices, no overt conflict, but the firmness on both sides is unmistakable. The segment continues, but the tone has changed. What began as a standard discussion has become something more layered, more reflective of the kinds of conversations happening beyond the studio. And as the camera briefly cuts to the audience, you can see it in their expressions. They're no longer just watching an interview. They're watching a real exchange unfold in real time, with both participants standing by their perspectives, and the outcome still uncertain. As the conversation continues, the tone remains steady but carries a new weight, one that's difficult to ignore if you're watching closely. The exchange between Topher Grace and Sunny Hostin has settled into a rhythm that feels more deliberate now, less like a typical guest segment and more like a careful, ongoing discussion where neither side is rushing to move on. There's a brief moment where another co-host attempts to broaden the topic again, bringing up how audiences today often respond instantly on social media, sometimes before fully understanding the context of a performance or a storyline. It's the kind of comment that usually helps reset the tone, giving everyone a chance to step back slightly. Topher nods in agreement, acknowledging that public reaction has become faster and often more intense than it used to be. For a moment, it seems like the conversation might pivot, but Sunny brings it back, not abruptly, but with a follow-up that builds directly on what's just been said. She points out that while rapid audience reactions can be unpredictable, they often stem from genuine concerns about representation and impact. Her voice remains even, but her phrasing is precise. She's not challenging for the sake of conflict. She's clarifying her position, reinforcing that her questions are rooted in a broader social context. Topher listens carefully, maintaining eye contact. There's no visible frustration, but his posture stays upright, engaged. When he responds, his tone is calm but noticeably more defined than earlier. He agrees that audience concerns are valid, but adds that creative work often requires space for interpretation, even when that leads to disagreement. The pacing of the conversation slows further. Each person speaks fully before the other responds, creating a kind of measured back and forth that feels very controlled, but also increasingly serious. Sunny then introduces a more specific angle. She references how certain portrayals, particularly those involving sensitive social dynamics, can shape perception, whether intentionally or not. Her question is framed carefully, but there's a directness to it. Does he believe actors have a responsibility to anticipate that impact before taking on a role? There's a noticeable pause before Topher answers. It's not long, but it's enough to signal that he's considering how to approach the question. When he speaks, he does so thoughtfully, explaining that while awareness is important, it's not always possible to predict how every audience will interpret a character or a story. He adds that if actors begin making decisions based solely on potential reactions, it could limit the kinds of stories that get told. His delivery is steady, but there's a quiet emphasis on that point, suggesting it's something he feels strongly about. At this point, one of the other hosts leans in slightly, offering a brief comment about how this balance between awareness and creative freedom is something the industry continues to navigate. The intention seems to be to keep the discussion balanced, to prevent it from narrowing too tightly between just two viewpoints. But Sunny isn't finished yet. She acknowledges that unpredictability exists, but gently pushes back on the idea that it absolves responsibility. She clarifies that her concern is less about limiting stories and more about encouraging accountability when those stories intersect with real-world issues. Her tone remains composed, but there's a firmness that's consistent now. She's not raising her voice, but she's also not softening her stance. Topher responds almost immediately this time, which marks a subtle shift. Earlier, he took longer pauses before answering. Now, his replies come a bit quicker, though still measured. He says that accountability is important, but he draws a distinction between responsibility and control. He explains that actors can approach roles with care and intention, but they can't fully control how a story is received or interpreted once it's released. As he speaks, he gestures slightly with his hands, emphasizing certain words. It's not exaggerated, but it adds to the sense that he's more actively engaged in the discussion now. The audience remains quiet, but attentive. There's a kind of stillness in the room that often accompanies more serious conversations on live television. It's not uncomfortable, but it's focused. Sunny listens without interrupting, then responds with a question that shifts the tone just a bit further. She asks whether there's ever a point where an actor should step back from a role if they feel the message could be misinterpreted in a harmful way. This question lands differently. It's more personal, more direct, and it introduces a hypothetical that requires a clearer stance. Topher takes a slightly longer pause before answering. He looks down briefly, then back up, as if organizing his thoughts. When he speaks, his tone remains calm, but there's a noticeable firmness to it. He says that while he understands the intent behind the question, he believes that stepping away from roles based on potential misinterpretation could lead to a kind of creative hesitation that ultimately limits storytelling. He adds that difficult or controversial stories often play an important role in sparking conversation, even if those conversations are uncomfortable. Sunny nods slightly, but her expression suggests she's still weighing his response. She follows up by pointing out that not all audiences engage with content critically, and that some may take portrayals at face value. At this point, the exchange has moved beyond general discussion and into a more nuanced disagreement. Both perspectives are being clearly articulated, and neither side is conceding ground. Another host steps in again, this time with a lighter tone, mentioning how these kinds of conversations reflect broader cultural shifts. There's a brief moment of shared acknowledgement around the table, small nods, a few quiet smiles, but it doesn't fully diffuse the tension. Topher adds a final thought to his previous point, saying that he believes in trusting audiences to grow and engage over time. He emphasizes that storytelling has always evolved, and that part of that evolution involves navigating these exact kinds of discussions. Sunny listens, then offers a short response, agreeing that growth is important, but reiterating that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Her words are carefully chosen, reinforcing her earlier points without escalating the tone. The camera briefly cuts to a wider shot, capturing the full panel. The visual alone tells part of the story. Everyone is attentive, engaged, aware that the conversation has taken on a more serious tone than initially expected. As the segment continues, the balance between discussion and disagreement remains steady. There are no interruptions, no raised voices, but there's a clear difference from how the conversation began. What started as a standard guest appearance has become something more layered. A moment where two perspectives are being explored in real time, without resolution, but with clarity. And as the conversation moves forward, it's evident that both Topher and Sunny are fully aware of the direction it has taken, choosing their words carefully, maintaining composure, and continuing the exchange in a way that reflects the tone of live daytime television, measured, respectful, but undeniably firm. As the discussion moves further along, there's a noticeable shift in how everyone at the table is engaging. The earlier rhythm, question, answer, brief follow-up, has now evolved into something more deliberate, where each point is being examined more closely before the conversation advances. The exchange between Topher Grace and Sunny Hostin continues to hold the center of the table, even as the other hosts remain present and attentive. Topher leans back slightly for the first time since the discussion became more focused, taking a small breath before speaking again. It's a subtle physical reset, but it suggests he's aware of how much ground they've already covered. His tone, when he resumes, remains calm, but there's a clearer intention now to define his position in a way that doesn't leave much room for misunderstanding. He explains that from his perspective, part of being an actor involves stepping into viewpoints that aren't necessarily your own, and that this process can sometimes bring uncomfortable or complicated ideas to the surface. He emphasizes that this doesn't mean endorsing those ideas, but rather presenting them in a way that allows audiences to engage and reflect. Sunny listens closely, her posture unchanged, upright, focused, hands resting near the table. When he finishes, she nods once, acknowledging his explanation, but her response comes quickly. She points out that while portraying different perspectives is part of the craft, there's still a distinction between exploration and impact. Her phrasing is careful, but the emphasis is clear. She's drawing a line between intention and outcome. There's a slight pause after she speaks. One of the other hosts glances toward the audience briefly, then back to the table, as if gauging the room. The audience itself remains quiet, but there's a sense of heightened attention. No one is shifting in their seats or looking distracted. Everyone appears focused on the exchange. Topher responds by addressing that distinction directly. He agrees that impact matters, but he reiterates that impact isn't always predictable or uniform. He gives an example, speaking generally, not referencing any specific project, about how different viewers can take away entirely different interpretations from the same performance. His tone stays even, but there's a subtle firmness in how he delivers the point. As he speaks, he maintains eye contact with Sunny, which adds to the sense that this is now a direct, one-on-one exchange within a group setting. It's not confrontational in the traditional sense, but it is clearly a moment where both individuals are fully engaged in defending their viewpoints. Sunny leans in slightly this time before responding, which is one of the first noticeable changes in her body language. She acknowledges that interpretation varies, but she raises the question of whether that variability increases the need for awareness during the decision-making process. Her voice remains composed, but there's a slightly stronger emphasis on certain words, particularly when she refers to influence. At this point, one of the co-hosts interjects briefly, attempting to widen the lens again by bringing up how different generations approach media differently. It's a thoughtful addition, and for a moment, the conversation opens up to include broader perspectives. Topher nods, agreeing that generational differences play a role, and Sunny also acknowledges the point. But the focus returns quickly. Topher adds that he believes part of the audience's role is to question and critique what they see, and that this interaction between content and viewer is what drives meaningful conversation. He stresses that if everything is pre-adjusted to avoid potential criticism, it could limit that dynamic. Sunny listens, then offers a response that is perhaps her most direct so far. She says that while dialogue is important, it often begins after the fact, after something has already been released and interpreted. Her point is that by then, the impact has already occurred, and not all viewers engage in that follow-up discussion. The tone in the studio remains controlled, but the weight of the conversation is evident. There's no background movement, no side chatter, just a steady focus on the exchange. Topher takes a slightly longer pause before replying. He glances down briefly, then back up, as if choosing his words with extra care. When he speaks, his voice carries a bit more emphasis than before, though still within the calm range expected for the setting. He says that he understands the concern about impact, but he believes that placing too much emphasis on anticipating every possible reaction could lead to a kind of creative restraint that doesn't serve the audience either. He adds that part of growth, both for creators and viewers, comes from engaging with material that isn't always comfortable or clearly defined. Sunny nods, but her expression remains thoughtful rather than fully agreeing. She responds by saying that discomfort can be valuable, but it doesn't automatically lead to understanding. She emphasizes that without context or responsibility, discomfort can sometimes reinforce misunderstandings rather than challenge them. This moment lands quietly but firmly. One of the other hosts softly acknowledges both perspectives, noting that the conversation itself reflects the kind of dialogue that happens outside the studio. It's a subtle attempt to validate both sides without pushing for resolution. Topher adds a brief clarification, saying that he's not suggesting responsibility doesn't exist, but rather that it should be shared across the entire creative process, not placed solely on the actor. His tone is steady, but there's a clear intention to refine his earlier points. Sunny responds with a slight nod, acknowledging the clarification, but she circles back to the idea that actors, as the visible face of a project, inevitably carry a portion of that responsibility in the public eye. Her voice remains calm, but there's a consistency in her stance that hasn't shifted since the conversation began. The audience remains engaged, and while there's no audible reaction, the stillness itself speaks to the level of attention in the room. At this stage, the exchange has reached a point where both perspectives are clearly defined. There's no confusion about where either side stands, and the conversation has moved beyond surface-level discussion into something more reflective of broader industry debates. Topher leans slightly forward again, signaling he's about to make another point. He speaks with clarity, reiterating that while he respects the concerns being raised, he believes in allowing space for storytelling to operate without excessive constraint. He emphasizes trust in the audience, trust in the creative process. Sunny listens fully, then offers a final response in this sequence, saying that trust is important, but so is accountability, and that the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. Her tone remains even, but the message is clear. The camera once again shifts to a wider shot, capturing the full panel. The visual dynamic shows a group that is composed, professional, but fully aware that the conversation has reached a deeper level than initially expected. As the segment continues, there's a subtle sense that the discussion is approaching a turning point. Not necessarily a resolution, but a moment where the conversation will either shift direction or begin to wrap. For viewers watching live, it's the kind of exchange that stands out not because of raised voices or dramatic gestures, but because of its clarity, its pacing, and the way both participants remain firm without losing composure. And as the hosts prepare to move forward, the impact of what's just been said lingers, quietly but unmistakably, in the studio. As the segment continues, there's a quiet sense that the conversation has reached its most defined point, yet it doesn't immediately wind down. Instead, it settles into a more reflective phase, where both Topher Grace and Sunny Hostin begin to reinforce their perspectives with a bit more clarity, rather than introducing entirely new arguments. Topher shifts slightly in his seat, his posture still attentive but less forward than before. It's a subtle change that suggests he's no longer trying to establish his stance, but rather to summarize it in a way that's easy for the audience to follow. When he speaks, his tone remains steady and composed, but there's a slightly more conversational rhythm to his words now. He explains that, from his experience, some of the most meaningful projects he's worked on were the ones that sparked discussion after release. He notes that while not every conversation is comfortable, that discomfort often leads to a deeper level of engagement. His point isn't delivered as a rebuttal this time, but more as a reflection, something that softens the edges of the earlier back and forth without changing his position. Sunny listens closely, maintaining eye contact. When she responds, her tone also shifts slightly. It's still firm, but there's a touch more acknowledgement in how she frames her words. She agrees that conversation is valuable, but reiterates that the starting point matters just as much as the outcome. Her emphasis is on intention, how decisions made during production can shape the way a story is received before any discussion even begins. There's a brief pause after she speaks, and in that moment, another co-host leans in to offer a broader observation. She mentions that what they're discussing isn't unique to one actor or one project, but part of a larger shift in how audiences and creators interact. It's a comment that resonates with the tone of the segment, and for a moment, the conversation feels less like a debate and more like a shared acknowledgement of a complex issue. Topher nods, agreeing with that framing. He adds that the industry itself is still adapting, and that expectations have changed significantly even within the last decade. His delivery is calm, but there's a sense of perspective in what he's saying, an understanding that the conversation isn't just about individual choices, but about a broader evolution. Sunny follows that by pointing out that with that evolution comes a heightened level of awareness, and that awareness often brings new responsibilities. Her tone remains consistent, but the way she phrases it suggests she's looking to bridge the gap between their viewpoints rather than widen it. At this point, the tension that defined the earlier part of the segment begins to ease slightly. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes less central to the exchange. The focus shifts from disagreement to clarification, from challenge to understanding. One of the other hosts takes this opportunity to steer the conversation toward a more audience-focused perspective, asking how viewers themselves can approach media more thoughtfully. It's a subtle pivot, but an effective one, allowing both Topher and Sunny to respond in a way that moves the discussion forward without revisiting the same points. Topher answers first, saying that he believes viewers benefit from engaging with content actively, questioning it, discussing it, and forming their own interpretations rather than relying solely on external commentary. His tone is relaxed, and there's a slight smile as he speaks, which lightens the mood just enough to signal a shift. Sunny responds by agreeing with that idea, adding that critical engagement is essential, but she also emphasizes the importance of context. She notes that not all viewers have the same access to background information or the same framework for interpretation, which can influence how a message is received. The exchange here feels more balanced. There's still a difference in perspective, but it's being explored in a way that feels less pointed and more collaborative. The camera briefly cuts to the audience again, and you can see a few subtle reactions, small nods, attentive expressions. There's no overt applause or interruption, but the engagement is clear. As the segment approaches its later moments, the hosts begin to wrap the conversation in a way that feels natural rather than abrupt. One of them summarizes the discussion, noting that it highlights an ongoing dialogue within both the entertainment industry and the audience itself. It's the kind of summary that acknowledges the complexity of the topic without trying to resolve it completely. Topher adds a final thought, reiterating that he values conversations like this, even when they involve disagreement. He says that being able to discuss these topics openly is part of what keeps the industry evolving. His tone is steady, and there's a sense of closure in how he delivers the point. Sunny follows with a closing remark of her own, emphasizing that while perspectives may differ, the goal is ultimately the same: to create and consume media in a way that is thoughtful and responsible. Her voice remains calm, and her expression softens slightly as she speaks. There's a brief moment of mutual acknowledgement between them, a small nod, a shared understanding that, while they didn't fully align, the conversation itself was worthwhile. One of the hosts then transitions the segment toward its conclusion, thanking Topher for joining the show and for engaging in what she describes as an important discussion. The tone at the table returns to something more familiar, professional, composed, and slightly lighter than it was at its peak. The audience responds with polite applause, not overly loud, but steady and appreciative. It's the kind of reaction that reflects respect for the conversation rather than excitement over a dramatic moment. As the camera pulls back slightly, capturing the full panel once more, the atmosphere in the studio feels settled. The earlier tension hasn't been erased, but it has been processed, understood, and placed within the context of a broader discussion. And as the segment prepares to transition to the next topic, there's a lingering sense that what just unfolded wasn't unusual for a show like The View. But it was certainly one of those moments that stays with viewers a little longer, not because of confrontation, but because of the clarity and composure with which it was handled. As the segment comes to a close, the shift back to a more familiar daytime rhythm is gradual rather than immediate. The conversation has already done most of its work, and now the focus turns to how it's being received in real time. Topher Grace sits back slightly, his posture more relaxed than it was during the height of the exchange, while Sunny Hostin maintains her composed presence, her expression thoughtful rather than firm. One of the co-hosts offers a brief closing remark, thanking Topher again, not just for appearing on the show, but for engaging in what she describes as a meaningful and respectful discussion. The wording is intentional. It signals to both the audience and viewers at home that what just took place was not a confrontation, but a conversation with substance. Topher nods in acknowledgement, offering a short closing comment of his own. He reiterates that he appreciates spaces where different perspectives can be shared openly, especially in a format like live television where there's little room to rehearse or refine responses. His tone is steady, and there's a sense that he's aware of how the conversation may have come across to viewers. Sunny follows with a final sentence, reinforcing that these kinds of discussions are important precisely because they don't always lead to agreement. Her delivery is calm, and there's a slight softening in her voice compared to earlier moments. It's not a change in position, but it is a change in tone, one that reflects closure rather than continuation. The audience responds with a round of applause, slightly more pronounced than before. It's not the kind of reaction reserved for humor or excitement, but rather one that acknowledges the seriousness and balance of the discussion. A few audience members can be seen nodding, others exchanging brief glances, as if reflecting on what they've just heard. As the camera begins to pull back and transition away from the segment, the panel shifts naturally into its next position. Papers are adjusted, a few quiet exchanges happen off mic, and the atmosphere returns to the familiar pace of daytime television. But even as the show moves forward, there's a clear sense that the conversation will extend beyond the studio. And it does. Within minutes of the episode airing, clips of the exchange begin circulating online, particularly highlighting the moments where the tone subtly shifted, where responses became firmer, pauses longer, and the conversation more focused. Viewers who watched live start sharing their impressions, many noting how measured the discussion felt despite the underlying disagreement. Some viewers express support for Topher's emphasis on creative freedom, agreeing with his perspective that storytelling should allow room for complexity without being overly constrained. Others align more closely with Sunny's viewpoint, emphasizing the importance of accountability and awareness, especially in an era where media reaches such a wide and diverse audience. What stands out in the online response is not division, but engagement. People are discussing the points being made, referencing specific moments from the exchange, and reflecting on how those ideas apply beyond the show itself. It's the kind of response that daytime programs like The View often aim for, not just immediate reaction, but ongoing conversation. Later in the day, short clips of the segment appear across various platforms, accompanied by captions that frame the discussion in slightly different ways. Some highlight the firmness of Topher's responses, while others focus on the consistency of Sunny's questions. The framing varies, but the core of the exchange remains intact, a calm, direct conversation between two people with differing perspectives. In follow-up discussions, including brief mentions on entertainment recap shows and online commentary segments, the moment is described as a measured disagreement, rather than a clash. That distinction matters, and it reflects how the exchange was handled on air. There were no interruptions that spiraled out of control, no raised voices that shifted the tone into something unmanageable. Instead, it remained grounded, structured, and reflective of the format it took place in. Behind the scenes, according to what's later shared in post-show commentary, there's no indication of lingering tension between the participants. Both Topher and Sunny are described as professional and respectful throughout, with any differences remaining firmly within the scope of the on-air discussion. In the days that follow, the segment continues to be referenced in conversations about media responsibility and creative freedom. It's not treated as a defining moment or a major controversy, but rather as an example of how these topics are increasingly being explored in mainstream spaces. For regular viewers of the show, the exchange becomes one of those memorable segments, not because of drama, but because of how clearly both sides articulated their views. It's the kind of moment that stands out quietly, without needing to be amplified. And as the episode itself fades into the larger flow of daily programming, the impact of that conversation lingers just enough to be noticed. It's a reminder of what live television can offer at its best, a space where conversations unfold in real time, where perspectives are shared without scripting, and where disagreement doesn't have to disrupt the tone to be meaningful. If you watched that moment, or if you've seen the clips since, it likely left you thinking about where you stand on the issue. That's what makes segments like this resonate beyond their airtime. So share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.